I recently waded into a discussion on Twitter where I defended the headmistress of the North London inner city school, Michaela, after she had herself gotten into a spat with the brummy, gobshite left-wing Labour MP, Jess Phillips. Said head teacher, Catherine Birbalsingh, had published an open letter defending herself against what she characterised as Phillips's attacks on her and her school. Birbalsingh is often characterised as Britain's strictest headmistress, both by supporters and denigrators of her approach to teaching, and she is, it must be said, a divisive character in the most precise definition of the word. She divides people. But being divisive is not always a bad thing. If one believes that education is going 100% in the wrong direction, as Birbalsingh obviously thought, it is a good thing to divide opinion, if even a small portion of that 100% can be turned in the right direction, then that is an obvious improvement. But of course this is all subjective, or at least it is being presented so. But Birbalsingh can point to some very objective results, as proof that her approach works, where so many are failing. The Michaela School opened its doors only in 2014 and it taught only one age group, what I would call first year secondary school, but is now known as Year 7. The following year taught Year 7 and 8 as their students aged. The year after that, 7, 8 and 9, and so on until the first cohort took their GCSEs in 2019. From a standing start, the school was placed 5th in the entire country, based on the government's Progress 8 benchmark. Once the first of Michaela's pupils had taken their A-levels, 82% were offered places at Russell Group universities. Now, as proof of Orwell's dictum that it is dangerous to be right when the established authorities are wrong, Birbalsingh has faced harsh and sustained criticism during all that time, which began even further back when she, a so-called woman of colour, dared to speak when invited at a Conservative Party conference in 2010. For that impudence, she was forced out of her teaching position and effectively, until the opening of the free school Michaela, out of education altogether. Now, I'm not particularly interested in education, my own children having left their institutions more than a decade ago. But Michaela's results really got to me. I had assumed that the only education worth having was one that you paid heavily into, like Eton, Harrow, and the one closest to me, Tunbridge School. But here was someone who had beaten the odds, and comprehensively so to speak. From nothing, she'd seemingly beaten almost everyone, including the elite fee-paying ones. That was enough for me, and I've been a fan ever since. Which is why I dived into the Twitter fray without a second's thought. I think I said something like, she was more successful than any of them, meaning her critics, and that hell hath no fury like a white saviour scorned, since she had often suggested that her most vocal critics had been white liberals who didn't like that she disagreed with them. And boy, did they not like that. I can't really say that it was a pile-on, but it garnered more engagement than almost any other thing I've ever put on Twitter. To be fair, I had as much support as criticism, but it's human nature to take more notice of the criticism than the praise. But what was curious about this was how many were refuting Michaela's accomplishments, which I thought were a matter of public record, and for that reason, unarguable. But there were people telling me that she wasn't successful, and that Michaela wasn't even the most accomplished school in the borough. And so I went looking, and I found it hard to find the glowing reports that I'd heard about. The last Ofsted report was from 2017, when Michaela was admittedly rated as outstanding. But then I went to the most recent school league tables, and I was unable to find the school even in the top 100. Where did 5th rate in the entire country go? So, suddenly unsure of my ground, I retreated from the debate, fearing that I had been somewhat rash in my defence of Miss Birbalsingh. Had I been seduced by a grifter? Was it all smoke and mirrors? Was Michaela's success merely self-promotion? I really don't think it is, and believe that she is the genuine article, but I made a mental note not to dive in headfirst next time. And I didn't have to wait long for my next opportunity, as a few days later, Nigel Farage's uncharacteristically lugubrious face was staring out of my laptop screen, telling me he may have to leave Britain because he was being denied a bank account. Suitably triggered, I watched and listened with interest. As many of you will already know, Farage was complaining that after many years, his bank, unnamed at this point, was closing his account and that it was a commercial decision. He then went on to say that he had been refused by 7 and then 8 different banks, all without real explanation. Obviously, he began to smell a rat. His suspicion, like many of ours, was that he was being refused banking services because of who he is, that the decision was a political rather than a commercial decision as claimed. If he was right, the fig leaf in question that allows his bank to do this is somewhat ironically a European directive which allows banks to refuse banking services to PEPs, which is a politically exposed person. After Brexit, which as most of us know hasn't really happened, should mean that this one is one of those EU regulations that was supposed to have been ditched. But the so-called bonfire of EU laws under our illegitimate Prime Minister is now not going to happen. But as when the same thing happened to Lawrence Fox and his Reclaim Party, so many focus on the individual concerned and not the principle. Farage, like Fox before him, was a horrible person and was therefore not deserving of a bank account. That seemed to be the extent of the argument. If Farage and Fox hadn't been so nasty, then maybe they could have bank accounts, just like the rest of us nice, kind people. It serves them right for supporting Brexit and Western liberal democracy. The complete and utter absence of anything remotely approaching principle really is somewhat staggering. But what's even worse is the lack of any understanding that the same expediency could, and almost certainly will, be applied to them when the pendulum swings back the other way. The "it's all right when we do it" is the reasoning of a small child. The small children who espouse such views cannot be debated or reasoned with. But it's those who engage in a more intelligent way can and should be. So having ignored the gleeful idiots, it is necessary to try and find some common ground with those who approach the subject with at least a modicum of fairness. And it is in this spirit that I got into an exchange that could have degenerated into a classic Twitter spat, but didn't. Cockwomble, his Twitter handle, said there must be something dodgy going on for Farage's bank to do such a thing, that if there was evidence of suspicious dealings, it was incumbent upon the bank to protect its shareholders and its other depositors from the possibility of being fined by the regulator if it emerged that there were illegal payments coming in or out and that they, the bank, ignored it, that it was their obligation to act. Now, this seems reasonable on the surface, if one subscribes to the idea that banks should be held liable for the crimes of their customers. I suppose it is reasonable. But if, like me, you don't believe that, then it isn't. And of course, the supposed big bogeyman here is the idea of money laundering. Anti-money laundering laws may be justified, but they may not be. Just because we have laws which are described as money laundering laws, it doesn't mean that that is what they are for. Just this surveillance has been sold to us as something that protects us. Any cursory investigation will reveal that the cameras are there simply to control us. It is, as I understand it, not actually possible to go into a car dealership and pay for your car in physical cash. £10,000 is the limit, I believe. And the reason? Money laundering. Or rather, that is the stated reason. Like surveillance, this is financial surveillance designed to keep an eye on us. Money laundering is merely the excuse. And it is this institutional suspicion of cash which has, unfortunately, bled out into wider society. The default position is that dealing in cash is inherently suspicious. Something dodgy must be going on. And this is not an accident. I heard that Mike Graham of Talk TV, not one usually to parrot a government line, mentioning that a guy ahead of him in the queue at the bank, on being questioned about where the £3,000 he was paying in come from, replied, I sold a boat. Graham then embellished the anecdote by saying that the cashier then said, "But you sold a boat last week, sir." Now, this may be true, and maybe the bloke in the bank was dodgy. Maybe he was a drug dealer. But maybe he wasn't. The suspicion, in my eyes, is unjustified. This is how the police view things. They see a young man with a flash car and a big wad of cash in his hand, with no visible means of support, and make the assumption that he is a drug dealer. But where is the presumption of innocence? Maybe he's got an internet business. Maybe he's inherited it. Maybe he has a trust fund. Maybe he knows that using cash is an effective way of keeping the government's nose out of his business. And maybe, just maybe, he's a man of principle who knows that it is good for society for cash to still exist. But just as our high-trust society has been degraded by 1,000 cuts into this mean, stingy and suspicious one, so our civilization takes another step on the road to totalitarianism by demonising anyone who still uses the notes and coins of the realm. In one exchange, Cockwomble said that he was glad that his interests as a bank customer were being protected. But I don't think they are. I think that the only interests being protected are those of the bank and the state. The state's interests are served by knowing precisely what is going on in the account of a potentially dangerous critic, and the bank's interests are that they can have the benefit of profiting from a wealthy individual such as Farage, but can ditch him the moment he changes from being an asset to a liability. But away from that principle for a moment and back to the slowly emerging details of the case. Soon after Farage released his post, a BBC journalist put up a post saying that he had been in touch with Farage's bank, now revealed as Coutts Co, to say that they had closed his accounts because he didn't have enough money in it. Now, leaving aside what appears to be a flagrant violation of the bank's obligations to its customers by revealing what is plainly confidential information, it also seems to be another stick with which to beat Farage, stating that Farage did not have the requisite £1 million in his current account further damages his standing, or so they think, by revealing that, on top of his irredeemably unpleasant character, that he is a pretender just playing at being wealthy without the funds to back it up. For normal types like you and I, this is an irrelevance, but for those who move in such circles, I can imagine that it is of the utmost importance. With this development, Cockwomble sent me a screenshot and asked me what I thought of it. Now this is progress. Our discussion, which started with us both gently needling each other, could have turned into a slanging match, but it didn't. This chap was asking what I thought. Since it had started in the tribal manner, depending on what each of us thought of Farage, he was now asking me, who knew, or at least suspected, as being on the other side of the aisle. Like I say, this is progress, and one we should embrace. So I told him that not meeting the bank's criteria, no matter how elitist or unfair, put a different complexion on the matter. I conceded the point. However, almost as soon as this detail emerged, reports came flooding in of other Coutts customers who had nowhere near the £1 million needed to maintain an account, had not done so for many years, and crucially seemed not to be in danger of having their accounts closed. Curiouser and curiouser. Somebody, it seemed, was not telling the truth, and it didn't look like it was Farage. An uncompromising truth-seeking fellow YouTuber, Politico, did some excellent detective work by digging up Coutts' terms and conditions and finding that it is indeed on their website. But according to the Wayback Machine, it wasn't 3 months ago. In light of this, Coutts is looking increasingly guilty, and that's potentially catastrophic for any financial institution, let alone a long-standing and prestigious outfit like Coutts Co, bankers to the late Queen Elizabeth II. Because trust in a financial institution like a bank is vital for its survival in the short, medium, and particularly the long term. Trust that said bank will not change the rules on you once you have deposited your money in it. It's astonishing that those at Coutts do not understand this. It's one thing having your logo and your premises festooned with rainbows, to burnish your woke credentials, as Coutts did during Pride Month. That's what happens, it seems, when your HR and marketing departments have been taken over by graduates who have degrees in lesbian dance. But it's quite another to have wealthy individuals withdraw their money because they can't trust that you are going to abide by the rules they set last week when the next current thing comes along, and they suspect, not know, suspect, that you don't agree with their values. If Coutts don't do some damage control and perform an immediate 180, their reputation is likely to be beyond repair. And as Politico has suggested, Farage is a pretty good legal case against them. Dragging Coutts' name, and their name really is everything, through the mud will do them no favours either. But to get back to the principle here, it's a bit of a stretch to say that being able to have a bank account is a human right. But only a bit. Having a bank account allows you to operate in a modern society. As a self-employed person, I could feasibly exist without a bank account. I could insist that my customers pay me, including any deposits, in cash. Whilst I could provide them with handwritten receipts, I would be fighting an uphill battle, not only because of the inconvenience to my customers, but it would also, as I mentioned above, lead into feelings of distrust. And remember that if I insisted on such a policy, it would require my customers having to go to their bank ahead of time in order to withdraw the cash that I required. And they would, of course, have to justify that to their bank. If the bank were not satisfied with their answers, they wouldn't release it. And it is becoming increasingly clear that that refusal is within most banks' terms and conditions. And until quite recently, this wasn't a problem. It wasn't a problem because, until quite recently, we could trust banks and other financial institutions to play by the rules and not some changeable and nebulous values. It may seem easy to break the rules in your favour in the moment. It may even seem clever. But strange as it seems to say it, in the world of small print, T's and C's and due diligence, the financial system still does run on trust. This is the reason that London is the centre of world finance. English common law, upon which contract law is based, makes it a stable and, moreover, a reliable place to do business. There may be corruption, cronyism, nepotism, perverse incentives, undue influence and all the other things that are certainly present in the world of business, but the players involved can at least rely on the fact that the rules will not change arbitrarily. And this is the reason that so august a financial institution as Coutts Co are playing with fire in not only refusing individuals an account based on their opinions or even the confected nature of politically exposed persons, but also by spilling their beans on their clients' accounts. Unless Coutts knows something that we don't, like a wholesale change in the nature of finance, such as an impending cashless society, which will make the entire notion of trust nothing but a quaint anachronism, we may see a thoroughly deserved reversal in the bank's fortunes. But debanking, as it is becoming known, since it is now common enough to be given a name, is the most severe form of cancel culture. Previously, the highest, or rather the lowest form of cancel culture was getting someone fired. That was losing someone their livelihood, which those doing the cancelling thought was justified for promoting hate, whatever that means. Essentially, it's for having a different opinion. But of course, it wasn't just the target whose life was seriously and negatively impacted. If the target had a wife or a husband, that person, who may be totally innocent of the supposed crimes of the target, and furthermore, may not even agree with the target's opinions. This is another thing that is not even considered by the cancellers, the notion that people who are close may not agree on everything, and yet still stay together. But that spouse is harmed as well. He or she is just deemed, I suppose, as justifiable collateral damage. And I suppose the argument might be that the spouse is in some way in league with the target, that they have made their bed and now they have to lie in it. No matter that being able to afford to have a bed in which to lie may now not be possible, what with the target being unemployed and all. But just for argument's sake, let's agree that they had it coming. But what about those that rely even more heavily on the target's earnings? What about their children? Are they guilty too? Did they have it coming? Are they even able to promote hate? They may not yet be able to talk, let alone reason, and yet the strident councillors believe themselves justified in stealing food from their young and blameless mouths, at least in theory. And in Farage's case, it is theoretical. Him and his immediate family are unlikely to starve, even if he has to move to America. But even someone with the financial heft as Farage, despite Coutts' scurrilous gossip, will not survive long without a bank account. Those that are fired from their jobs can get another, again at least in theory, but the mere fact of being without a bank account may prevent them from further employment, no matter how impressive their CV, and even despite any goodwill shown by their prospective new employer in regard to their dismissal from their previous position. There's an old expression, all's fair in love and war, which implies that whilst there are no rules in either love or war, there are rules in everything else. In the days of conquest and before the notion of surrender, that was true. To the victor, the spoils. The winner could take any woman he desired and execute any man by the pure fact of being the winner, which is why the fight was to the death. That was just how things were. But the human society evolved. When an enemy knew he was defeated, he could raise the white flag, concede the battle, and not expect to be slaughtered. Likewise, the raping of the women of the defeated was outlawed, at least while anyone was watching. But the point is that as humans evolved, even in war, there are rules. And these rules are codified in the Geneva Convention. By refusing someone a bank account, we are back to the Wild West. This is a financial war without any rules. It is effectively a fight to the financial death, to ruin. Nothing is off the table in the councillor's desire to win, at all costs. And those costs are considerable. In fact, those costs are more than almost anyone can bear if they find themselves on the wrong side. But the councillors seem not to imagine that they will ever be on the wrong side. Maybe they're right. Maybe the pendulum will not swing back against all historical evidence. Goering, Goebbels and Eichmann thought that until Nuremberg. Piers Morgan thought that when he was foaming at the mouth about the unvaccinated. Although slime ball that he is, he's managed to slither his way out of punishment. So far. Maybe they'll think they're fair like Morgan rather than Eichmann. But what surprises me so is that those who are celebrating Farage's defenestration seem not to realise that it can and almost certainly will happen to them when the wind changes. I am more surprised by the complete lack of foresight than I am horrified by their complete lack of morality. And I really am horrified at that. There has to be rules. If there are no rules, there is only power. Right now, the power is being expressed by the HR departments of large corporations, coerced and contorted as they have been by the power behind them. That of the leviathans of corporate finance, BlackRock, Vanguard and State Street, who support firms and banks who comply with their ideology of diversity, equity and inclusion, climate change, mass immigration and globalisation, of which Brexit is the antithesis. That's the situation at the moment, and the most current of current things is the proxy war in Ukraine, of which BlackRock in particular is set to gain from its reconstruction. Those who celebrate the financial crippling of Farage, Fox and anyone else who doesn't agree with them need to look a little further than the end of their noses. NATO in general and the out-of-control American administration are continuing to fuel the war in Ukraine. Are the Russians being bled dry as we are told? Who knows? But they haven't collapsed yet, and the regime is still standing. As the Ukrainians throw ever more of their young men into this futile endeavour, what happens when there are no more? Is it beyond conceivable that NATO troops will be thrown into the fray? As the conflict escalates, is it beyond the realms of possibility that, having failed to topple Putin, conscription may well be introduced in NATO countries, including, of course, the United Kingdom. What happens when it's their children being fed into the meat grinder, since refusing to do so may be construed to be against the bank's values? The giddy and joyful cheerleaders of Nigel Farage's misfortunes think they will never be on the wrong side of the state and their unholy fascistic alliance with the financial institutions. In a world where the rules were flattened simply to satisfy a tribal prejudice, the choice will be send your sons to the front or we'll cancel your bank account and ruin you. And what will they do then when they've dug that hole for themselves?